Hello, receiving students, teachers, and 6E. Thank you. You may take your seats. All right, in our last lesson, receiving students and 6E, we looked at moon phase, and we looked at different moon phases. All right. Receiving students and 6E, we are still looking at the same outcome, strand and substrand. And our topic for today's lesson, tied to the moon. All right, receiving students and 6E. I have up in the screen 2 pictures, okay? 2 pictures. Picture A and picture B. Okay? Picture A and picture B. In groups, I will give you 2 minutes. 2 minutes to discuss the difference between these 2 pictures. Are we following, receiving students and 6E? Okay. So you have the 2 pictures. I want you, in your groups, discuss the difference between these 2 pictures. I'll give you 2 minutes. All right, receiving students, you can give to teachers. Let's hear from the model class. What can you tell about these 2 pictures? What is the difference between these 2 pictures? Malaysia, thank you.
High tide and low tide.
High tide and low tide. Very good. Can you identify which one is the high tide?
Picture A is high tide and picture B is low tide.
Very good. Give 3 big claps. Thank you. So you have, in picture A, you have the high tide. And in picture B, you have the low tide. Okay, so this is the difference between these 2 pictures. Okay, very good. Now, let's look at these 2 questions. Question A and question B. What causes high tide? That's question A. Question B. What causes low tide? You will still work in your groups, and I want you to discuss among your group members and try to identify what is the cause of low tide and what is the cause of high tide. Are we clear, receiving students and 6C? Okay, so I want you to copy down these two questions into your exercise books. After copying down the questions, then you discuss among your group members and you try and identify the causes of high tide and the causes of low tide. I will give you 5 minutes. 5 minutes to discuss and answer these two questions. Okay, by now you should be discuss and write some answers down or some causes of low tide and high tide. All right, receiving students and 6C, by now you should have answered the two questions. Now let's hear from the receiving students and also from the model class. What causes high tide? Helen, thank you.
When the sea level rise up, it causes high tide.
When the
Sea level rise up, it causes high tide.
Okay, Ellen said when the sea level rise up, it causes high tide. Good. What else? Receiving students, you can give your answers to your teacher. What else? How about low tide? What causes low tide? What causes low tide? Now, students from the coast, you should have some fair ideas, okay? Students from the coast, especially students who live along the coast, you should have some ideas on what causes high tide and what causes low tide. Moral class, you're in Mosby and you are telling me that you don't know what causes high tide and what causes low tide. Robert, what do you think? Thank you.
When ice melts at other countries, it causes high tide.
It causes high tide. When ice melt in other countries, it causes high tide. Okay, Robert, I'm asking for the low tide. Okay, the answer is also correct. I'm asking for the low tide. What is the cause of low tide?
When the sea level goes down.
When the sea level goes down, it causes low tide. Okay, let's write this down. Okay, so this is Robert's answer. When the sea level goes down, it causes low tide. Okay, Now, these answers are correct, but since we are looking at moon tide, Rodney, thank you. Again, loud, a bit loud.
Number one, what causes the high tide? When the moon became to full moon, and that's when the high tide began. Number
What-
two,
Sorry. When the, a bit loud and slowly, not fast.
when the moon became to full moon, and that's when the high tide began.
When the full moon. Okay. Okay, we can say that when there is a full moon, you will see high tide, or you will experience high tide. Is that true? Receiving students and 6C? Okay. It's to do with moon, okay? How about low tide? Rodney, thank you.
When the moon became to, no? When the moon is going down, that's when the high tide is going down to make low tide.
When the moon is going down. Okay. Or we can say, can anyone help Rodney? People from the coast, students from the coast, you should have some ideas. Okay? You should help our students from the islands region. Okay? People from the islands, they don't know. Oh, Victoria, thank you.
When there is a new moon, we experience low tide. When there is a new moon, we experience low tide.
Very good. Give her 3 big claps. Now, as you can see, receiving students, Victoria, she's from Islands in Anga province. But she knows, okay? She knows, which is good. So when there is a new moon, you experience low tide. Very good. Now, let's look at this diagram here, receiving students and 6E. Now, as you can see, when the sun, are we all looking in front? Thank you. When the sun, moon, and earth, when the sun, moon, and earth are in line, there are gravitational pulls, or the gravitational pull is increased, then you experience high tide. Okay? When the sun, moon, and earth, when they are in line, the gravitational pull is increased. And that's how it causes high tide. Another word for high tide, we say spring tide. Spring tide. Another word for high tide is spring tide. Now, the cause, the low tide, what's the cause of low tide? When the sun is not in line, okay? When the sun is not in line, with the moon and earth, the gravitational pull is decreased. And as a result, it causes low tide. Okay? When the sun is not in line with the moon and the earth, okay, the gravitational pull is decreased. So it causes low tide. So here we have, okay, they are not in line. So another word for low tide is neap tide. Okay, neap tide. Are we following, receiving students and 6E? Okay. So you should know another word for high tide is spring tide. Low tide is neap tide. So here we have another diagram showing the spring tide and the neap tide. So here is the spring tide. Okay, this is the spring tide. The sun, the earth, and the moon, they are in line. Okay, they are in line. And here we have the neap tide. So neap tide occurs during the first quarter moon, the third quarter moon, and the first quarter moon. That's where you experience the low tide. Whereas in the high tide or the spring tide, it occurs during the full moon. Are we following, receiving students and 6E? Okay, very good. So now, by now, receiving students and 6E, we should know the causes of high tide and low tide. This is your summary for today's lesson, receiving students and 6E. So when there's a full moon, you will experience high tide. People are, especially students or people from the coast. During the new moon, you will experience low tide. So the highest tide, or we can say high tide, called the spring tide, usually happens at full moon and new moon. But mostly it occurs at full moon. Okay, this is the next summary point. The lowest tide, or we say low tide, called neap tide, usually happens during the first quarter and last quarter, or sometimes we say third quarter. And our key phrase for today's lesson, 6C and receiving students, moon tides. And our next lesson topic will be on star patterns. We will look at star patterns. Receiving teachers and students, you should provide the following materials: pictures of stars and diagrams of star patterns. With that, receiving students and 6C, thank you very much for your participation, and you have a nice day with your teacher.